and gentlemen, you're very welcome to the Four Courts, to the historic centre of the administration of justice in Ireland. It's marvellous to see so many gathered here in this wonderful hall this evening. We assemble for a lecture to be delivered by Professor Diarmaid Ferriter entitled Scrambling for the Bones of the Patriot Dead. This public lecture is part of our series of lectures, which is organised by the Courts Centenary Commemoration Committee, and the committee's aim is to commemorate centenary events which relate to the courts and to lawyers. The committee was established in 2013 when Ireland commenced its decade of centenaries, and the committee members consist of members of the Judiciary, the Court Service, the Department of Justice, the Office of Public Works, the Bar Council, the Law Society and Trinity College, and we're planning further lectures and events in the Four Courts in the next few years. The committee is organising this series of lectures and is doing so in an inclusive way, reflecting the diversity of Ireland's history, and we hope that our endeavours will be of interest to those working in the law and to all interested in Irish history. Apart from the lectures, we've organised other events, including with young people. We had a drama and art competition, which tied into the decade of centenaries, and we've also had a most successful walk which was in the legal quarter and therefore relevant to events of our commemorations. Our island has a rich history which spans the millennia, but we live in a relatively new state, and the events of 100 years ago had a divisive influence on the direction of this island and its people, and a decisive effect. We remember the major events such as the lockout of 1913, the World War, the Rising, the War of Independence, the Civil War, the nation building and building peace. History, however, also comprises the ordinary lives of ordinary people, private and family lives marked by these events. Over the last 100 years, Irish men and women from every part of Ireland, of every faith and none, were involved in the more public struggles of the Irish people, whether it was in labour strikes, civil unrest, war or nation building. And let us hope that by commemorating the times of our ancestors, it will remind us that the story of Ireland is a work in progress and that we all have a place in that and can contribute to it. The words of the philosopher George Santayana has a particular resonance during this decade of commemoration, when he said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Events such as this evening's lecture and those planned in the future allow us to remember and understand the events of the past. This evening's lecture will explore the intriguing question of how the events of 1916 have been commemorated over the last 100 years. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Diarmaid Ferriter. Professor Ferriter is a well-known historian, writer and broadcaster. He's a graduate of UCD, both his BA and his PhD. He's been a researcher and writer with the Dictionary of Irish Biography. He was senior lecturer in St. Patrick's DCU. He was a visiting Burns Scholar at Boston College, and since 2008 he has been a professor of modern Irish history at UCD. Many of you will recognise his voice from the programmes he has had on RTE radio and television, What If, which he hosted weekly on RTE1, and the history show RTE Radio 1. In 2010, Professor Ferriter presented a three-part television series, The Limits of Liberty, concerning senior politicians of the Irish Republic and the Irish Free State. And Professor Ferriter has a weekly column in the Irish Times. He's a member of the expert group advising on the decade of centenaries. He's a member of the committee of the Irish Historical Society of Ireland. He's a member of the advisory committee of the Military Service Pension Files. He was a board member of the National Library from 2010 to 2012. And he has, of course, written many highly acclaimed books, and these include Judging Dev, a reassessment of the life and legacy of Eamon de Valera, which won 3 categories of the 2008 Irish Book Awards. His book, Transformation of Ireland, 1900 to 2000. Then What If? Alternative Views of 20th Century Ireland, on which his radio programme was based. Occasions of Sin, Sex and Society in Modern Ireland, on the history of sexuality in the 20th century Ireland, and Ambiguous Republic Ireland in the 1970s. His most recent book A Nation and Not a Rabble, The Irish Revolution 1913 to 1923, is a comprehensive account of the revolutionary decade of the early 20th century. The book is based on research in new sources and provides fresh perspectives and has been referred to as magisterial, compelling, and illuminating. It has been praised for giving voice to history's silent souls. This book was nominated for an Irish Book Award in 2015. Its title, A Nation and Not a Rabble, is based on comments by George Gavin Duffy, who was a barrister, a TD, and in fact he was also former President of the High Court. He had served as an envoy for the Irish Republican movement in Paris during the War of Independence and was appointed Minister for Foreign Affairs in the Irish Provisional Government, which was formed following the ratification of the treaty. Gavin Duffy had expressed a fear that the impending civil war had the potential to do lasting damage to Ireland's reputation abroad and the fledgling Free State dignity. And Professor Ferriter refers to his advice that both sides of the treaty should ensure that Ireland was seen as a nation and not a rabble. So I'd ask you to welcome Professor Diarmaid Ferriter, who will speak on Scrambling for the Bones of the Patriot Dead.
Thank you, Chief Justice, for that very warm and very comprehensive introduction. It's much appreciated. I want to thank Helen Priestley here as well for all that she's done to make tonight possible, and also Macdara O'Driscoll, who was very helpful in sourcing some of the images that you will see tonight. And thank you all for making the effort to come tonight. I really do appreciate it. It's great to see such an engagement with the centenary of the 1916 Rising, and we're only warming up. There are an enormous amount of commemoration plans in train at the moment. This is a double first for me tonight. I've never lectured in the forecourts, and I have never used PowerPoint. I tried in vain to prevent the use of PowerPoint tonight on the grounds that the downgrading of the spoken word was simply not good enough, especially in the forecourts, but I lost that particular battle. Nonetheless, it means I can stand before you blameless and pure if anything should go drastically wrong with PowerPoint. You never know, I might actually get used to it. I mentioned the space that's opening up in relation to the commemoration of 1916. What I really want to look at tonight is the question of how we have arrived at that point where there is such a large space for remembrance of 1916. I want to look back at the evolution of this question of commemorating 1916, what was appropriate, what was inappropriate, what were the nuts and bolts of commemorating 1916 at various stages since the foundation of the state in particular. It's interesting to look back, not just because the commemorative episodes of previous times are illuminating of themselves, but also because they shed so much light on various societal, political developments and rows. And they also are very helpful in allowing us to appreciate currents, themes, influences, controversies that are still relevant, or versions of them that are still relevant in relation to commemorating 1916 today. So it can be very helpful to look back and identify what the trends were, what the pressures were, what the prejudices were at various stages since the early 1920s. And how to commemorate 1916 did generate a degree of disagreement and debate. Was solemn remembrance of 1916 going to be complicated or undermined by those who were seeking to make political capital out of the legacy of the 1916 Rising? There were very different views on how it should be approached. You can see a variety of different perspectives in relation to who should be in control of commemorating 1916. And there's a tendency to believe that commemorating 1916 only became complicated after 1966. The idea of an orgy of self-congratulation, as David Trimble described it in the 1990s, speaking of the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising. The idea that that hugely complicated commemorating the Rising in subsequent times, added to, of course, the terrible backdrop of the Troubles in Northern Ireland and the carnage that was going on in those decades after the end of the 1960s. And of course, 1966 did present particular challenges. Nonetheless, there were plenty of challenges there prior to 1966, which perhaps are not appreciated as much as they could be. There were always complicating issues in relation to remembering 1916, the extent to which it should be a political commemoration, or a religious commemoration, or a military commemoration, or perhaps a combination of all three. To what extent could it be a credible focus of reconciliation, or provide a credible focus of reconciliation? And this is where I suppose we can give some brief attention to the Civil War. Anne Dolan, a historian in Trinity College Dublin, has written very perceptively about remembering the Civil War and commemorations of the Civil War. And she pointed out in relation to remembering the Civil War that there were years when it was useful, there were years when it was embarrassing, there were years when it was fashionable, years when it was fickle, years when it was inconsequential, and of course controversial years. And there were always those who didn't care either way. And what I'm interested in this evening is the extent to which that particular list can be applied to remembering the 1916 Rising, because Anne Dolan has maintained that in relation to 1916, there wasn't the same sense that 1916 commemorations or remembrance were intended to divide, or were going to highlight divisions in the way that Civil War commemorations were, that there was not, with 1916 commemorations, the same sense of regret that you would get at a Civil War commemoration. The idea that the Civil War commemorations represented the death of the hope that 1916 had represented. That's an interesting perspective, but I think it's only partly true in relation to 1916. There were disagreements and difficulties around commemorating 1916, particularly in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. There were divisions, and a certain tedium had set in by the 1950s in relation to the contested legacy of 1916. How, during these formative decades from the 1920s onwards, were the politicians and the political class going to manage this? If you consider Commemorating, what became Fine Gael, if you consider Fianna Fáil, if you consider the divisions between them, were they going to exploit the emotional capital, if I can call it that had accumulated as a result of 1916? Why were they rowing about how to remember 1916? And to what extent is the observation of Claire Wills, another historian, about 1916 remembrance being a mixture of pious reverence and political point scoring? To what extent can that be applied throughout these decades? One theme that does predominate is that of exclusion. And exclusion has always been a question in relation to commemorations. And it's applicable to the wider debate about commemorating not just 1916, but other events of the revolutionary era. And the way the critic Edna Longley, who you'll see there, summed this up was by suggesting that commemorations are as selective as sympathies. They honour our dead, not your dead. So that'll give you an indication of the extent to which commemorations can divide and can cause comment about fractured and divided societies. And that certainly is apparent at various stages. And you'll appreciate that the difficulties in the early 1920s were obvious. The Civil War divides, the Civil War wounds that were still very much red raw. The government, the Commonwealth government of the early 1920s, was faced with this question of what it would do in relation to 1916. And it wanted to keep things very understated. An interesting correspondence ensued between Clement Shorter, who was the widower of the poet and sculptor Dora Shorter, who wrote to William T. Cosgrave, the president of the Executive Council, the leader of government in the 1920s, and was offering £1,000 from his wife's estate for one of her sculptures to be fashioned in marble and set on a pedestal of lime in Glasnevin Cemetery. And what was at the centre of this piece of sculpture were the 1916 leaders, Patrick Pearse at the very centre of them. And Patrick Pearse was obviously somebody who Cumann Gael were reluctant to talk about in the early 1920s, given what Patrick Pearse meant to their Civil War opponents. Cosgrave was very worried when he pondered this question about what the view of Margaret Pearse, Patrick's mother, might be. He doubted if the Pearse family would want anything to do with a project that had the backing of the government. But he also had other reservations. He suggested that engaging in this project might make it look that we want to have one last slap at the British, and they were his own words. He was also concerned about an excessive focus on those who had been executed after the 1916 Rising, as opposed to those who participated at the more general level. There was also the question of whether or not this particular monument would have the potential to overshadow the grave of Arthur Griffith. And Arthur Griffith's widow, Maud, had crossed swords at various stages with the government in the 1920s in relation to the remembrance of her husband and whether enough respect was being afforded to the legacy of Arthur Griffith. Now, eventually, it was agreed that this project would go ahead, but I think it's very revealing that there was no public unveiling of this particular monument. There was no formal ceremony to unveil this monument. It was done in a very understated and a very quiet way. And that sums up much about how the Commonwealth government at that stage were approaching remembering 1916 and formal state commemoration. There was the first formal military commemoration of the Rising in 1924, and this did involve a formal remembrance, and it did involve the government and the army at that time. But there was also in 1924 a rival commemoration, and this is one of the enduring themes of this era, rival Republican commemorations to challenge the commemorations of the government. If you consider the homage to Glasnevin, for example, or the procession to Glasnevin, which was been led by Republicans in 1924, that was going to be the rival commemoration. The government also had to deal with the thorny issue of who should be invited to formal commemorations. Only one of the widows of the 1916 executed leaders accepted an invitation from the government, and that was the widow of Michael Mallon. This was also in 1924. The government also made a decision not to include any irregular TDs, in other words, anti-treaty Sinn Féin TDs at that time, not to invite them to any of the state services for 1916 remembrance. It's not all about piety and righteousness, however. There was satire in relation to 1916 from an early stage. That's perhaps not surprising given some of the outlandish claims that were made in relation to 1916. Dublin Opinion, the satirical magazine in 1924, published a cartoon in relation to the legacy of 1916. And this was a drawing of the GPO. The context for this was some of the debate that was going on in the new state about whether there was considerable tourist potential at that time. Could Ireland be made an attractive place for foreign visitors? Could there be potential in relation to developing the Irish tourist industry? And there was concern about the quality or the lack of Irish accommodation for tourists who were visiting the country. But Dublin Opinion in this cartoon was not concerned about that. Under this drawing of the GPO, they included the caption, "Accommodation is not a problem in this city. This building held 30,000 patriots in 1916. So there was that irreverence and that satire there from an early stage, mixed in or paralleled with some of these more serious developments. But you also had the question then of what would happen in relation to the 10th anniversary of the 1916 Rising in 1926. And here is where we see the re-emergence of Eamon de Valera, a spectacular political comeback, the formation of Fianna Fáil, which coincided almost exactly with the 10th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, and de Valera and his colleagues, his new Fianna Fáil party, once again leading a rival commemoration, once again going to Glasnevin Cemetery. And this was done under the auspices of the Easter Week Commemoration Committee. And de Valera's words at that particular rival Republican commemoration were words that endured. The homage of our appreciation, he said, is not enough, while the task to which the 1916 rebels devoted themselves remains unfulfilled. And that was the kind of pious approach that was being taken in 1926 by the Republicans. The government remained understated in its response, and the events were perhaps unfolding too rapidly, or were moving too quickly for a very settled view of 1916 to emerge. I think it's fair to say that references to Patrick Pearse were actually quite scarce by the late 1920s. True, in 1926, the decision was taken to rename Great Brunswick Street Pearse Street in his honour. But there's a curious silence about the 50th anniversary of the birth of Patrick Pearse in 1929. There was this idea that it was better not to go there in relation to the memory of Pearse. But what we also got, of course, in relation to the 10th anniversary of the Easter Rising was this extraordinary play, The Plough and the Stars, which was staged at the Abbey Theatre in 1926, caused such controversy that it led to a riot in the theatre at that time. And the Abbey stuck with its playwright Shaun OCasey and defended his right to give his interpretation of 1926. But it did, of course, raise this issue of how certain characters and writers were going to respond to the foundation myth of the Irish state. Shaun OCasey was somebody who had been immersed in some of the political, trade union and social movements of the early 20th century. He was somebody who had very strong views in relation to the relationship between the labour movement and the national movement. He was somebody who considered that the labour movement had been sacrificed on the altar of nationalism as a result of the events of this period. And you could argue that he was one of the first critical historians of the revolution to the staging of The Plough and the Stars in 1926. He was somebody who had also passionately held views about the circumstances that the citizens of Dublin found themselves in the 1920s, but also in 1916. The same year that he wrote The Plough and the Stars, he wrote a letter to a friend in which he said, "It isn't a question of English or Irish culture when it comes to the inanimate patsies of the tenement buildings, but a question of life for the few and death for the many." And in that year alone, 44,000 people died of TB in Dublin City. And you can see how he was being animated by this perspective and by these themes when you look at the play also. Patrick Pearse is very much on the outside in The Plough and the Stars. His words are relayed through a pub window. Talk of the sanctifying and redemptive power of bloodshed. But what did that mean to the tenement dwellers in 1916? That's one of the themes that he is exploring. And the language that he was using. The presence of a tricolour in a pub, the presence of a prostitute in a pub offended many. He was accused by many of the Republican women of that era, including Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, of making a mockery and a byword of a revolutionary movement. To counteract that argument, you could argue that what he was doing was actually shining a light on the dark interior and reality of what 1916 had meant for many citizens in Dublin in 1916. But he was regarded, in the words of one of the Abbey players, as going beyond the beyonds in relation to the language that he was using and the perspective that he was bringing to bear at that time. Now, we don't need to elevate Shaun OCasey as a supremely objective witness to history. He was nothing of the sort. Arguably, he didn't allow the nationalists in the play to make a fair case in relation to the 1916 Rising. But nonetheless, he was entitled to his critical perspective, and it was a nuanced and layered perspective in some ways. And we often talk today about new perspectives. Not all of these perspectives are new. Shaun OCasey was offering some of those challenging perspectives in 1926, and whilst you can talk about the protests and the likes of Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, who had every reason to feel aggrieved given that her husband had been so brutally murdered in 1916, you also have to appreciate that the Abbey was full for the duration of the play's staging, and it became and remains a touchstone play for the Abbey Theatre. But I think it was also something that can be seen as a significant act of commemoration, or perhaps anti-commemoration on the 10th anniversary of the Rising. The big question as you move into the early 1930s is how Fianna Fáil is going to deal with commemorating 1916 now that it has achieved power for the first time with the help of the Labour Party initially and then on its own in 1933. There was what was described by the Irish Press newspaper, which of course supported the Fianna Fáil party, as an unprecedented commemoration in 1932. And the paper maintained that this was not a commemoration for any one party, it was a commemoration for the people in 1932. And that year the Irish Press also sought to make capital out of the death of Margaret Pearse, Patrick Pearse's mother, who we saw there a moment ago. The idea was that Mrs. Pearse was important because of what she symbolised in relation to the legacy of 1916. The Irish press suggested, for example, that those who were in the presence of Mrs. Pearse were in the presence of the inviolate tradition of Irish nationhood, and that when men saw her, party divisions dropped away, which was delightful exaggeration on the part of the Irish press in the early 1930s. But there were more contentious issues that were being discussed, sometimes privately, sometimes publicly, as you move in to the middle of the 1930s. Richard Mulcahy, for example, Richard Mulcahy, who was a senior member of Cumann and Gael, soon to be Fine Gael, raised a question in the Dáil in 1933 in relation to the government's, the Fianna Fáil government's 1916 remembrance services. Richard Mulcahy wanted to know if the government had deliberately withheld 241 names, 241 invitations that had been issued to commemorations in the late 1920s. Frank Aiken replied on behalf of Fianna Fáil that he had indeed struck off 241 bogus pretenders from the list. Many of them, he maintained, had played little, if no part in the 1916 Rising. There was also the question of how Fianna Fáil would increase access to 1916 in remembrance of 1916. They allowed public access to the graves of the executed leaders at Arbour Hill, for example, in the early 1930s. They also inaugurated a new state ceremony to honour the executions of the 1916 leaders, which again became part of this panoply of commemorations. But then you also had the difficult question for de Valera in particular of how he was going to deal with the IRA. The IRA, of course, claiming that it was the true sole inheritor of the 1916 mantle. 1936 was the 20th anniversary of the Easter Rising, but it was also the year that de Valera's government declared the IRA an illegal organisation. And in some ways, it became even more important for Fianna Fáil to try and take control of 1916 commemorations because of that situation with the IRA at that time. But before that happened, there were more rows. In particular, quite a vicious row in 1934 and 1935 about this particular statue, this sculpture by Oliver Shepherd of Cuchulainn in the GPO. A proposal was put before the government in 1933 that this should be placed in the GPO. In the words of the Department of Finance, it was supposed to be a feature of the building as opposed to a monument to 1916, but it wasn't exactly seen like that. There was a committee established, a memorial committee, to try and decide how this particular project should be approached in the 1930s. And this is when the rows began in relation to who should be involved, in relation to who should be invited to the unveiling committee, in relation to the extent to which the groups who were represented on the memorial committee could actually work with each other. What kind of groups am I talking about? Clan na Gael, for example, which represented the pre-truce IRA, the 1916 clubs, the Irish Republican Soldiers Federation, various groups who had an interest in propagating the legacy of 1916. The government also had to decide who it should invite, and it was decided that all ex-TDs could be invited, but only if they had service in 1916. So along with serving TDs, you had ex-TDs, but only if they had that particular pedigree for this unveiling ceremony in 1934. And in 1934, you also had, I suppose, an increase in the political temperature as a result of W.T. Cosgrave joining the debate. He maintained that he would not attend the unveiling of the statue of Cuchulainn because it was becoming a partisan party political event. Maud Gonne, on the other side of the debate, as a true Republican as she defined herself, maintained that she would have nothing to do with this either. You could not trust this government in relation to protecting the legacy of 1916. Richard Mulcahy also complained that the ceremonial firing party for this ceremony was being drawn from just one side of the Civil War within the army. You then had the resignation of a number of different groups, including Clan na Gael, the pre-truce IRA that I mentioned earlier on. So this is all going on behind the scenes, but it begins also to play out in public, partly as a result of a very powerful statement that was released by William T. Cosgrave, who elaborated on why he wanted nothing to do with this ceremony. He suggested the time was not yet ripe for what he described as sober reflection. Bitterness and envy and suspicion, he continued, we have in abundance. You couldn't hide, he said, these national humiliations or try and cover them with a veil lifted from the bronze statue of Cuchulainn. The United Ireland newspaper that supported Cosgrave and the Fine Gael party went further. An editorial in the paper maintained that it was always unseemly, if not indecent, when political parties engage in a figurative scramble for the bones of the Patriot dead. So you can see the degree to which those tensions had been exacerbated by the middle of the 1930s. This idea that this was becoming a one-sided partisan affair, remembering 1916. There were other proposals towards the end of the decade about declaring the 24th of April, the actual anniversary of the Rising, a national holiday, which was battered away in favour of commemorating it at Easter every year whenever that fell. That question has been in the ether for many decades. There was also, for de Valera, towards the end of the decade, an opportunity to be included in the Roll of Honour for 1916. In 1936, at an event at the National Museum, this ornamental parchment, the Roll of 1916, the Honour Roll of 1916, was unveiled. But you also had concerns being expressed by some in government about the lack of knowledge on the part of younger people about 1916. And again, this has been an enduring theme. It doesn't just belong to more recent times. Tomás Derrig, for example, who was de Valera's long-serving Minister for Education in the 30s and the 40s, expressed concern about the lack of knowledge on the part of those who were taking the Leaving Cert in relation to the 1916 Rising and its leaders. And I mention that because ultimately that provided the impetus for what became the Bureau of Military History project, the idea of gathering testimony from the 1916 veterans to get a collection of what Tomás Derrig referred to as a statement of facts from the Irish point of view, as opposed to what was prevailing then in what he called British propaganda, they being the history books that were being produced in Britain at that time. The question for the 25th anniversary of the Rising in 1941 was how it would be approached by a government that at that stage, or a state that at that stage has won considerable sovereignty. This, of course, is the time of the Second World War. This is a time when de Valera has taken the independence struggle, as he sees it, to its logical conclusion by being able to implement an independent foreign policy. So there was a desire to assert that Ireland was ready to defend its shores in the event of invasion. And of course, many people volunteered for service in relation to local defence forces. But there was also the question of how the state would approach the formal commemoration for the 25th anniversary, a significant anniversary of the 1916 Rising. And you can trace the evolution of this dilemma through the archives, the National Archives and the files in the Department of Defence in particular. Early in 1940, the Department of Defence was making various suggestions in memoranda about how the 25th anniversary might be approached. But they were wondering whether precedence should be given to the military or the religious aspects of 1916 as opposed to the political aspects of 1916. There was a concern also about what was referred to as the political implications of working with the National Graves Association, which was regarded as a body too green by that stage. There were also some quite elaborate plans drawn up by the Department of Defence that included a pageant of history in the Phoenix Park with searchlight effect, a mass victory parade past the GPO in the centre of Dublin City, a national céilí, or Irish dance, to mark the occasion, and also an athletics gathering in Dublin, which would involve torches of freedom being brought from the four provinces. And this was modelled on the Olympic ceremony. De Valera was not impressed with these particular plans in 1941. He suggested that there was no question of such elaborate plans being implemented. It was not appropriate given the circumstances nationally and internationally due to the emergency and the Second World War. And he also crossed out the word victory in relation to the proposal for a victory parade past the GPO. Now it would just be a parade, it appeared. And what he wanted, he said, was a single military event. Nonetheless, The service, the remembrance, the state ceremony in 1941 was a significant one. It's estimated that 25,000 people or so were in the vicinity of the GPO. It was described again as the most spectacular commemoration of 1916 to date. It was also notable for the awarding of 1916 medals, which had been specially minted for the occasion for the 25th anniversary, and de Valera received the first one as the sole surviving commandant of the 1916 Rising. But there were other occasions for de Valera. There was the ongoing IRA campaign, particularly the IRA bombing campaign in Britain around that time. There were also IRA hunger strikers, some of whom were allowed to die by de Valera and his government during the emergency. And de Valera made a broadcast during this period in which he said the IRA had no moral right to claim to be the inheritors of the 1916 mantle. Their claim, he said, cannot be substantiated by an appeal to the facts of Easter week or by an appeal to the sentiments of its leaders. It's also worth noting some of the robust cultural criticism that was emerging around the time of the 25th anniversary of the Rising. And this has been another feature of commemorations through the decades. Sean O'Faolain, for example, was very vocal through his wonderful magazine, The Bell, in 1941, about tradition and creation. This is an editorial that he wrote under that title to mark the 25th anniversary of the Rising. And he suggested if there's any distinct cleavage amongst us today, it is between those who believe that tradition can explain everything and those who believe that tradition can explain nothing. We are living through a period of conflict, he maintained, between the definite principles of past achievement and the undefined principles of current ambition. Contradiction is everywhere. It was true, he elaborated, that much of the Irish emotional bloodstream was made up of memory. But just how happy would James Connolly be with the Ireland of 1941? There were two reasons for a commemoration in 1949. The declaration of the Irish Republic, but also, of course, the anniversary of the Easter Rising. So why not combine them in 1949 at Easter? Fianna Fáil was quite sour about this, having lost office in 1948. They decided instead to go to the graves at Arbour Hill, while Sean MacBride, a member of government, found himself in Glasnevin Cemetery. So quite divided in relation to location for this particular remembrance in 1949. John A. Costello, as the Fine Gael Taoiseach, made what I think was a very magnanimous gesture in inviting de Valera to join him in a joint broadcast to mark the coming into being of the Irish Republic and its formal inauguration. De Valera refused. This was not an occasion, he said, for rejoicing. Frank Aiken joined in. Whilst the task to which they devoted themselves remains unfulfilled, he maintained, it was not appropriate to celebrate the coming into being of a 26-county republic. And you can see again the echo of that rhetoric from 1926. What Frank Aiken and de Valera suggested was that the coalition government was just belatedly saluting the achievement of the 1937 Constitution, which had made this state a republic in all but name. Not a single comma of the Constitution had to be changed in order for the Irish Republic to come into existence, maintained Frank Aiken. And again, you can see the sourness of these words. To use the particular logic that was being used at that time by Fianna Fáil, they should not have been commemorating the 1916 Rising either. But again, I think there's also an indication by the end of the decade and into the 1950s that some of these particular rows are becoming quite stale. There is a focus in the following decade on Arbour Hill. Should this be left as a place that is stark, unadorned, given what lies there, given what it represented? And there was considerable discussion about whether or not there should be a plan to decorate it, to adorn it in some way. The idea of carving a cross on the ashlar wall, the idea of including a portion of the proclamation of 1916, and eventually that was agreed on by different governments over the course of the 1950s, but it was not a matter of considerable public discussion. What was also becoming apparent, particularly to some of those who represented 1916 veterans and through the old IRA represented War of Independence veterans, that what became apparent to them was a dilution, it appeared, in the enthusiasm for remembering 1916 and for remembering the events generally of the revolutionary period. And you can see some very poignant correspondence between some of these veterans, some of these representatives, and the government in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. I'll single out one in particular because it's almost heartbreaking. Patriot Nolan and Frank Casey, who were from an organisation, the Federation of IRA 1916 to 1921, that represented the interests of the veterans, pointed out that they had largely become welfare associations as opposed to commemoration associations. But nonetheless, they still mobilised every year. The problem, as they saw it, was the proliferation of parades. The battalions themselves would mobilise on particular dates, on the 24th of April. But the government had its formal commemoration at Easter. You also had disagreement as to how far out these particular commemorations should be spread and who might be involved. But they referred in their letter in 1962 to the Taoiseach Shaun Mass, this Federation of IRA 1916 to 21, referred to the adverse comment that had been caused by recent commemorations, that they had ceased to command respect, that there were handfuls of old men who were marching behind our national flag and no longer turning heads. They went further and suggested that in Dublin in particular, there were young motorists who were hooting them out of the way and breaking their ranks with indifference, if not contempt. That was also during a period, and the Irish Times maintained that there was an obvious Irish youth culture. The idea that many younger people were happy to bury the past, not just with disdain, but also, it appeared, with relish. But nonetheless, there was going to be continued interest in commemorating 1916 as the 50th anniversary approached, the 50th anniversary of the Rising in 1966. And this is where Shaun Mass, in particular, found himself in a difficult situation. In the run-up to the 1966 commemorations, he had to deal with Kathleen Clark, the redoubtable, remarkable Kathleen Clark, who was the widow of Tom Clark, the senior executed leader in 1916, certainly in relation to age. But she went further than that. Kathleen Clark threatened to go public with the truth if Shaun Mass did not respond sympathetically to her correspondence. What exactly was the issue that she had? There was no doubt, as far as she was concerned, that Tom Clark was the real president of the Irish Republic declared in 1916, not Patrick Pearse. Patrick Pearse, she said, took advantage of the confused circumstances of Easter week 1916 to sign documents that he should not have signed. She went on to suggest that he should have been satisfied with the position of Commander-in-Chief, given that Pearse knew as much about commanding as my dog. A weary Shaun Mass passed on this correspondence to Jack Lynch, who we saw a moment ago. Jack Lynch made some discreet inquiries and discovered that Kathleen Clark's own son did not agree with Kathleen's interpretation of Easter week 1916. But it does give you an indication, of course, of what some regarded as unfinished business. And Kathleen Clark was very visible around the middle of the 1960s and could be seen in broadcasts with her memories of the events of that week. But the Mass is also interesting here for other reasons. The same year that Kathleen Clark was writing to him, he made a public intervention in relation to Irish men who had served in the British Army during the First World War. He suggested that they had died as honourably as any of the thousands who had given their blood. He referred very publicly to the idea that they needed to be remembered. There may still have been a questioning about their motivations, but they had died for what they believed in. Now, if you consider Shaun Mass, consider the school that he would have been in Dublin City, the Christian Brothers School in Dublin City in the late 19th and the early 20th century. What happened to Mass's class? in relation to the First World War, in relation to 1916. They all went in different directions. 30,000 Dubliners volunteered for service in the British Army during the First World War, and 19% of them were killed. Shaun Mass would have known this. Shaun Mass was also somebody who had shot dead his own baby brother when practicing with a volunteer rifle a couple of years before the 1916 Rising. Another brother of Shaun's, Noel, had been brutally murdered at the very end of the Civil War. Mass had various reasons not to be bombastic about 1916, notwithstanding his own involvement. There was interesting correspondence with the British ambassador in Ireland at that time, who wondered whether he should get out of the country for the duration of the 1966 ceremonies. And he was reassured that the events would be orientated towards the future as opposed to the past. And Shaun Mass used a lot of rhetoric to that effect around this time. Think of Ireland, not, he said, of the Ireland of the Sean Van Vocht, but the Ireland of the technological expert. There's something of a tug of war going on between past and present as you move in to the 50th anniversary of the Rising in 1966. And I think Mass is disturbed by what he regards as the fierce and vengeful tone of the poetry of Patrick Pearse, which he believed was appropriate to 1916, but was not so appropriate to 1966. Nonetheless, you do, despite Mass's reluctance to scramble for the bones of the Patriot dead, you do get a very elaborate commemoration in 1966 that's reflected in a variety of different ways. There were, of course, stamps commemorating 1916. There was also a very elaborate and formal remembrance at the GPO. De Valera, as President of Ireland, as I mentioned earlier on, the sole surviving commandant of the 1916 Rising, that living link very much in evidence in politics and beyond it. And those state ceremonies were, of course, taken very seriously. But there were other initiatives. The opening of the Garden of Remembrance to honour those who had died for Irish freedom. You also had the opening of the museum in Kilmaine, where the 1916 leaders had been held before their executions. You also had all sorts of parades that were planned across the country. School children were encouraged to engage with the history of their area and to turn their attention to the 1916 meaning and legacy. There was a pageant in Croke Park. Once again, that became a focus for the idea of the legacy. Was there triumphalism? Of course there was triumphalism in 1966. But let's also remember that there was considerable tension behind the scenes. Those involved in the labour movement, for example, were worried that they had been shoved aside, that the narrative was dominated by nationalism. There were feminists who protested in 1966 that not enough attention was being given to the role of women in 1916. There were writers and intellectuals who complained that from the point of view of culture, Ireland in 1966 was a disgrace. And you had to remember all of those involved in the 1916 Rising that had come out of the cultural movement. So it's not that those criticisms weren't there. They certainly were there. There were also novel and ambitious and creative efforts, including Insurrection, written by Hugh Leonard, shown over the week of Easter 1966. Dramatic, invigorating, novel, and regarded at the time as groundbreaking and exciting and very well received. It hasn't been shown on Irish television since. Hugh Leonard remarked when he was planning this particular project that it seemed as gallant and doomed as the Rising itself, but it was actually something that was regarded as a considerable success for RTE at that time. And then you had poor old Horatio Nelson, the fine standing pillar outside the GPO in 1966. Isn't it interesting that it was the unofficial gesture that provided the iconic moment for the commemoration in 1966? Renegade Republicans deciding that Nelson's pillar would no longer be. And there are the remains of Nelson's pillar after they had carried out that particular project. Now, this caused a degree of concern, of course, but it also caused a degree of mirth. One of the big questions was, where the hell is Nelson's head? because it had disappeared. The Irish Army also had to deal with the aftermath of this attack by finishing the job that the renegade Republicans had started. In doing so, they blasted out many windows, shop windows and business windows in O'Connell Street and faced a compensation bill as a result. But I think it's fair to say that this was a hugely popular gesture. There's Nelson's head today, if you're wondering, in the Pearse Street Library. Up Went Nelson was a song that topped the charts for 8 consecutive weeks as a result of this particular episode for the 50th anniversary in 1966. You also had the Ballymun Project, to name the Ballymun Towers after the signatories of the 1916 proclamation, which were regarded as, again, innovative, groundbreaking, incredibly modern in 1966. Who was to know what would go wrong at that time? Now, when you consider the difficulties and the opportunities of 1966, you can see why they came more sharply into focus, the difficulties towards the end of the decade, particularly with the outbreak of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. There was also, perhaps it's fair to say, a certain weariness that was setting in anyway. Taoiseach Jack Lynch, for example, in 1972, received a little note from his secretary in relation to further invitations for further 1916 commemorations. And this is quite a cheeky note from Jack Lynch's secretary in 1972. What he suggested was that the Taoiseach should give himself a break from these remembrance services. These people have been dead for 50 years. I'm sure they wouldn't mind. May I say you'll be away? Lynch, however, didn't stay away and was mindful, I suppose, of the damage that might do in relation to remembering 1916. But it was becoming complicated. There's no doubt about that. That, of course, was the year in which nearly 500 people were killed as a result of the Troubles. And I'm not going to go into this in huge detail. But the Troubles is, of course, the backdrop to what you could describe as a big silence in relation to 1916 and remembering 1916. The military parade, the formal state military parade, was abandoned in the early 1970s as a result of the Troubles. There's also the thorny issue of what to do with the legacy of Pearse, particularly by the end of the 1970s, because 1979 represents the centenary of the birth of Patrick Pearse. An internal government memoranda reveal that this is a government grappling with this dilemma. Should we emphasize that Pearse was first and foremost a poet and an educator as opposed to a commander-in-chief? This is why we see the emphasis shifting to St. Enda's, the educational legacy, the Pearse Museum that was a project of the 1970s. That's certainly one indication of the dilemmas that were faced. There was also a suggestion that there should be a 24-foot statue of Patrick Pearse erected in O'Connell Street in the 1970s, which again was emphatically rejected by the government on the grounds that it would be an obvious target of loyalist paramilitaries, as indeed Wolfe had been during that decade. There is a degree of amnesia, there is a degree of concern, obvious concern given the extent of what is going on, but also a refusal to confront the difficult questions that are being raised about the relationship between violence then in 1916 and violence current in 1976, for example, the 60th anniversary of the 1916 Rising. And that, I think it's fair to say, is where Conor Cruise O'Brien came into his own in relation to his excoriation of the legacy of 1916. Conor Cruise O'Brien was Minister for Posts and Telegraphs in the coalition of 1973-7, but he was also Minister for denouncing the Provost and Minister for denouncing 1916 by extension, as he saw it. And he made this particular intervention in 1976 in relation to Patrick Pearse. He described him as a manic mystic nationalist with a cult of self-sacrifice and a strong personal devotion to death. The nation that takes Pearse as its mentor is a nation on a path to moral obliquity, a nation engaged in a project of intellectual dishonesty. Is this revisionism, or is it gratuitous? Much is thrown into the mix in the 1970s and the 1980s, But what is apparent is that 1916 is not going to be commemorated in any significant way by the state. And there were complaints from various relatives of 1916 participants about this official amnesia as they began to describe it, or what Declan Kyberd was later to refer to as the elephant of revolutionary forgetfulness. And I don't want to underestimate the difficulties and in the climate that were so apparent in the 1970s and the 1980s. But we do have to look at how debate about 1916 was reductive, was reduced to ideas of democracy versus dictatorship or sectarianism versus inclusion. Was there revision that was not so much about revising as about fervent wishes that certain things had not happened or that certain other things had happened? And this does culminate, I think, in 1991 with the 75th anniversary of the Rising in a relatively muted commemoration. Once again, it's revealing that the commemoration is being driven by others, by intellectuals, by writers, by artists, by the likes of Robert Balla, for example, who was very vocal in relation to the official neglect when it came to the 75th anniversary of the Rising, and some of the relatives, of course, were vocal in relation to that. But it's also the case that some of the relatives were happy to see the focus shift from military commemoration, given what they regarded as the long-term consequences of the events of this period. Patrick Wallace, the director of the museum, also mentioned that it was suggested to him that he take the guns out of the National Museum because they were sending out the wrong signal. That'll give you an indication, I think, of the environment that existed at that time. Of course, after the long troubles, you get the peace process. You get the idea, once again, of commemorating 1916. In parallel with ideas of shared history, in parallel with a premium being placed on the idea of diverse Irish experiences and remembering and honouring diverse Irish experiences, including the Battle of the Somme, you also get the re-emergence of a pride in 1916, as is articulated by various people. Some of them, including President Mary McAleese and Bertie Ahern in 2006, at the time of the 90th anniversary of the Rising, did seem to be operating in cahoots with each other in relation to trying to out-republicanize Sinn Féin. And there is concern that Sinn Féin at that time is seeking to make political capital out of the 1916 Rising. President McAleese made a significant address at a conference in Cork in 2006 in which she referred to the 1916 project as, from the outset, a multilateral enterprise. She talked about how far-sighted and European the leaders were in their thinking, that they were ardent feminists, that they would have celebrated European integration and Ireland's role in joining the European Economic Community as it was originally. But there was this idea that everything that had happened to Ireland in the 1990s they would have hailed, including the Celtic Tiger, which he maintained they would have embraced with considerable gusto. Some saw in that an exaggeration, others saw an overdue but welcome determination to confront doubts about the origins of the state. And again, you can see how these particular tensions that were essentially a hangover from earlier periods were being belatedly confronted. But that doesn't mean that it is all plain sailing or straightforward. In 2001, for example, at the time when the Mountjoy 10 were taken, their bodies taken from Mountjoy, these were War of Independence Republicans who were executed and left in Mountjoy jail. When they were taken and reinterred in Glasnevin Cemetery, formal state funeral, Cardinal Cathal Daly made much mention of the failure to implement the social promises of that era. And we do see a new focus on the idea of the failure to deliver on the social promises of the 1916 generation. It's certainly apparent then in 2001. Of course, you also have the growing momentum of the peace process, perhaps the icing on the cake of the peace process with the Queen's visit to Ireland in 2011. And again, much focus on the idea of the end of a particular chapter of Irish history. A reigning British monarch had not visited Southern Ireland since 1911, exactly 100 years before. But there are also other issues that are relevant to how this is being played out politically. John Bruton, for example, former Taoiseach, who has been very consistent in his criticism of 1916. He believes it was a mistake, a costly mistake that should never, ever have happened. And yet, in recent years, he has been publicly slapped down by the current Taoiseach, Eamon de Valera, who maintains that his party, Fine Gael, is a party and a proud party of 1916. You also have other politicians who are fighting over the 1916 toy, just in case you can't see it there. This is the 1916 Rising Centenary toy being fought over by Taoiseach Eamon de Valera and leader, President of Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams. And again, you can see how they have been levelling accusations at each other about the hijacking of 1916. Micheál Martin has also maintained that Sinn Féin is engaged in a sinister use of the 1916 commemorations. While Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael might seem to have much in common in their excoriation of Sinn Féin, others will often mention that Sinn Féin did not have involvement in the 1916 rebellion, certainly were not involved in the organisation of the 1916 rebellion. So certainly those rows are going to continue. But what's also fascinating from the historian's perspective is the idea of new ideas, new information, new source material that tells us so much more about the 1916 Rising and indeed the 1916 insurgents. The new resources that are becoming available. Many of them can be accessed very easily. Many of them have been digitized. I'm thinking in particular of the military service pensions files. One of the last large pieces of the jigsaw in relation to the archive of that period. Those who applied for pensions based on their service during the years 1913 to 1923. This is such a voluminous archive. It amounts to nearly 300,000 files. Not because 300,000 people applied for pensions based on their 1916 service, but because of the whole administrative infrastructure around it. And again, we're getting the power of personal testimony. People who were applying for recognition of their military service during this period had to outline in great detail exactly what they had done and where they were at various stages. And for the purposes of a pension, service in 1916 in Easter week accounted for 4 years for pension purposes. So it was a very long week indeed when it comes to participation in the 1916 Rising. But this archive is also heartbreaking. It's a chronicle of great disappointment. The vast majority of people who applied for pensions did not get them. The bar was set very high in relation to qualifying for pensions. There had to be proof. There were referees. There was an advisory board. There were interviews. There was correspondence in abundance in relation to claims and disputed claims. James Butler, for example, aged 17 at the time of his service in the 1916 Rising, maintained that what he was looking for was not charity. He was justly entitled. He eventually received a pension for his 1916 service of £17 a year. You're not dealing with people becoming wealthy on the back of military service pensions. The vast majority of pensions are very modest indeed, in the region of €2,000 to €3,000 today, in today's money. But what you can begin to detect in the archive is a hierarchy of benefit. The widows, for example, and relatives of the 1916 leaders, who were eventually in receipt of very considerable pensions. The widows, for example, pensions of £500 a year back in the 1940s and 1950s, a very considerable sum. And yet you had War of Independence widows who were only in receipt of pensions of between £80 and £100. Now this is causing consternation and causing disagreement. You also get this vexed question at an early stage of what constitutes a combatant in 1916. Margaret Skinner, for example, one of the most high-profile female combatants in 1916, who was shot in the GPO in 1916. She applied for a pension in the 1920s based on her service in 1916. And in looking at the correspondence now, you can see why she became infuriated. She was informed that the legislation was for soldiers as understood in the masculine sense. In one line of the Department of Defence's bureaucracy, women are airbrushed, combatants are airbrushed from their participation in 1916. She had to fight a 13-year battle to get recognition of her service, which she eventually did in the late 1930s. You also have occasions of light relief, I'm glad to say, in the Military Service Pension Archive in relation to 1916. Margaret Pearse, the sister of Patrick Pearse, at the age of 89, was getting very fed up with the bureaucracy associated with the pensions, with having to fill out forms year after year to ensure that her pension as a sister of Patrick Pearse continued to be paid, and she was also a serving senator. At the age of 89, she had had enough. She tackled a young pup in the Department of Defense who was asking her to fill in yet another form to confirm that her marital status had not changed since the previous year. I can assure you, she wrote to the Department of Defense, that at the age of 89, I am not considering marriage anytime soon. Do you know who I am? So you do get that occasional blasts of light relief. Maybe not how Margaret Pearse saw it as light relief, but certainly for the reader. You also have, as a result of the focus on new sources and new information, you have the ability to transform the presentation of 1916, the exhibitions on 1916, the capital projects that the government has committed to in relation to a new museum, for example, in the GPO, or a project for Richmond Barracks, these capital projects as they are referred to. There's been questions about whether or not there has been enough consultation. Relatives complained quite bitterly a couple of years ago about the lack of consultation that was going on, and indeed there wasn't much consultation going on because there didn't seem to be any blueprint there to form the basis of consultation. But it also raised a question as to the extent to which relatives of 1916 participants should be on some kind of a pedestal. Going back to this question I raised at the outset about what role they should play in driving commemorations. You also had a suggestion as a result of the success of the peace process that there should be a royal presence in Ireland in 2016 to build on the achievement of the Queen's visit in 2011. That was quietly dropped. It did seem to involve a rush of blood to the peace process head. But what would it have involved in practical terms, never mind symbolic terms? It would have involved lockdown in Dublin city centre. You couldn't develop this narrative of a people's commemoration in 2016 if that was going to be involved in commemoration. There's also this suggestion that the rising has to be seen from all of the different perspectives relevant in 1916. Once again, the First World War coming back into the frame in a large way. The idea that there were multiple definitions of loyalty in Ireland 100 years ago. That you cannot reduce those who were serving in the British Army. You cannot reduce their identity to that of British imperialists. There were plenty of nationalists, for example, who fought in the British Army during the First World War. 3 of them were interviewed in 1915 by the Irish Times, and they were asked as 3 brothers why they were leaving jobs to go and fight with the British Army. And their response was that Mr. John Redmond said, "This is as much Ireland's war as England's war, and we want to fight for Ireland." And we also have much more information now on those Irish soldiers who were on leave in 1916 and were called up to face down their fellow Irishmen and women. We also have much more of a sense of the shock and the bewilderment of some of those British troops serving in Ireland who were called up at short notice to try and suppress the rising. We do get perspectives on this from literature also. Sebastian Barry in particular in marvellous novels such as A Long, Long Way. He's raiding the treasure trove of his family's history in order to come up with very, very powerful fiction. It was barely disguised fiction. The idea of the multiple allegiances that existed in Ireland at that time, but also those who find themselves on the wrong side of history. those who were left to what Barry described as their hideous wounds and asylums. And it's not about accusing, he said, it's just to state that it is so. We also now have a welcome recognition of the civilian experience. The best-selling non-fiction book in Ireland last year was Joe Duffy's Children of the Rising, the 40 children who were killed in 1916. Innocents, of course, caught in the crossfire. One of those victims had a mother who was interviewed at that time. Did she think it was a good thing for more people to die for Ireland? And her response was that what Ireland needs is for people to live honestly for Ireland. We haven't heard those kind of civilian voices to the same extent. And even consider the project The Letters of 1916, which is looking to digitize correspondence from people in all walks of life in 1916. What was the civilian experience? Think of marvelous Michael Gorman, now in his 80s, who was interviewed about the letters, the correspondence between his courting parents, Michael Gorman and Susan Fitzgerald, a Catholic and Protestant couple, and the difficulties that created for them. Michael Gorman, the son, discovered this correspondence, and he was asked, what side were your parents on in 1916? And he said they weren't on any side in 1916 except the getting on with life side. And there were those trying to get on with life in 1916, and that civilian experience is certainly one that is receiving a lot more welcome attention now. But there are still contentious issues, going back to these themes and influences and impulses and currents that I highlighted in previous decades. And I'll conclude my remarks by just reflecting on a few of them. There has been a suggestion from the historian Ronan Fanning that there should be a shameless celebration in this year, 2016, to remember the 1916 Rising. But at the very same time that he was making that claim, we had the assertion of the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Charles Flanagan, that commemoration of 1916 cannot be seen to be divisive. How do you square that particular circle? How do you reconcile those two particular perspectives? One thing you can do, hopefully, is restore complexity. The complex narrative of 1916 is demanded by the sources. A complicated narrative of 1916 is imperative. You don't need to bully pride out of existence. Courage, dignity, and nobility are very much a part of the 1916 story. But so is unmandated violence. So is this whole question of the victims in 1916. So how do you reconcile these different impulses? If commemoration is to be true to history, of course, and true to historical reality, it has to be, to a certain extent, divisive. We can over-egg the shared history pudding to the extent that you can have these soft-centered aspirations that don't really mean anything in practice. And that is something that we have to confront. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that historians should be arrogant enough to believe that they should be directing this particular process. Historians should not be antagonizing, nor should historians see themselves as healers in relation to these conflicting impulses or conflicting historical traditions. But we do have to see it as being a military event. We do have to be skeptical of the idea of an ahistorical retrospective consensus about the reality of very divisive events in Ireland and beyond in 1916. We also have much focus on the proclamation. The proclamation is often wrenched from its historical context and latched on to a variety of different causes and different projects. The words we hear most frequently from the proclamation are cherishing all the children of the nation equally. They did not refer to children as we understand them in the modern era. This was about bringing together unionist and nationalist. There are various other aspirations and promises in the proclamation that are being bandied about by various people, depending again on the prevailing political or social currents. Children are also being asked in early March, in the form of a proclamation day, to write their own proclamation for their times. A cynic might respond, why not just implement the one that we already have? And again, that proclamation, what it represents, will continue to generate significant debate. But whilst I'm on the subject of children, I should say that there is an irony in relation to government plans for commemoration at the same time that there seems to be a plan to downgrade the status of history in our schools by ensuring that it is no longer a compulsory subject for junior cert. But this is something that brought to my mind Eric Hobsbawm, a wonderful historian who died a few years ago. He said part of the problem with the modern era is that people are living in a sort, or growing up in a sort of a permanent present, lacking any organic relationship to the public past of the times that we live in. This is something that needs to be addressed. And why not take advantage of remembering 1916 in order to address that particular problem? And of course, people have to take ownership of this themselves. This should be led from below. Of course, the state has its job and the army has its job in relation to formal commemoration. But this is something that has to be led in a broader sense by people on the ground. Those working in county libraries, those involved in historical associations, those who are very proud disseminators of knowledge about our past. And what those individuals have now is distance, is space, is more perspective, is perhaps a relative peace, certainly compared to what was there before, but also an abundance of new information. And I do hope that when it comes to the overall commemorations, that those new perspectives can be used for a commemoration that is illuminating and is reflective, but above all informed. Thank you for your patience.